So as we think about the last bigger component of our project, something that we haven't talked much about in this class just yet in depth, is the idea of how do we use type or typography. And what we're going to do with the project we're working on is take this image library that we've developed in the first part of the project, and we're going to add text to it. And you've actually written text earlier on in the project, but we can use that as a starting point. But as we think about type and typography, we need to know a little bit about it and how do we pay attention a little bit to it. So we're going to, like I said, we're going to take imagery that we've developed and combine type that we've written, combine those two components, those two elements, and actually use them in our solution. And type is an important tool within this industry, in this field, and it's actually a class devoted to it right after this one in typography is the second class in the series. So just kind of background for you. But even if you're working on screen related things, you still need to think about type. And especially if you're thinking about, do people need to read something on the screen? Okay. So one way that we can just collectively think about type is calligraphy. And some of you maybe have practiced calligraphy before, where you're looking at creating letter forms in the exact specific way that looks really clean and it's understandable, and it's done by hand. Another one that's done by hand in a similar way is just lettering. And if you've ever created your name with bubbles, that's lettering. And it's a common way of thinking about it. And there's much more detail you can get into as you actually practice lettering. But both of those are done by hand for the most part. But the third one that we look at is just typography. So how do we look at and consider the design of letter forms, but more importantly, the arrangement of them in a two-dimensional space? So yes, typography can be involving the actual creation of a font or a typeface. But what we're looking at here in this class is more of the arrangement of them, and thinking that we are going to be print or screen based. And if we add motion, if you're involved in multimedia, you're going to add motion and time and how we make it more interactive. So typography is an important part of this field as we consider it. Okay. And as we start to just look at some differences in what typography is, we think about space. And we think about what makes one font different than another. And we think about, well, something that's proportional, for example, gives the letter I a different space than the letter O. Versus the monospace version, each letter gets the same amount of space left to right. And what we want to do as we think about type is consider the spacing between letters. And if we make things cramped or spread out, that changes a little bit of how it's understood, unless we choose the font that has that given space already. Okay. But a lot of type thinks about or considers the negative space as well. We've talked about that a lot with design in general. But if you think about it in terms of type, the negative space is really important. The negative space can tell us just as much as the positive space, if not more. So pay attention to the negative space that's left, and maybe you can turn that into a shape or use that as part of your composition as you work. Okay. So here's some components that we need to know, just really basic format of what letters are and how they work and what makes one font different from the other. So everything sits on a baseline. And a baseline is just a horizontal line where letters, kind of the foundation of them, right? And they go up to what's called the cap line. And the cap line is just the height of, for the most part, the height of the capital letters. And so the baseline is where everything sits. Something that goes below the baseline is called the descender. And anything that goes that's non-capital that goes up to the cap line is the ascender, right? So we look at those as those that are different. You can probably think about other letters that would have descenders, a Q, a J. You can think about other letters that would have ascenders, a D, a B, right? So there's letters that you can think about. Where they actually go to begin with, the foundation of the letter is what's called X height. And it actually is the space or the height of the lowercase letter x. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. The other thing, we have most letters have strokes, right? So the P and the H specifically, just as an example, are created with this long vertical stroke that you start with. And then what they have is a bowl and a counter. And a counter is the negative space within those letter forms, and the bowl is the curved shape. So it's important to think about with that. We also have what's called a serif, and a serif is the finishing stroke on parts of a letter. And those are all different. And again, I'm just giving you the basics and what typography is about, but you'll understand as you look that what makes one font different from another is everything on this page. So your bowls and your counters might be different. Your ascender might be really high. Your descender might be really low. Your serifs might be a different angle. A lot of those things are different, and that's what makes one font different from another. Okay, so knowing the basics of that part of a letter can be helpful. So if you think about those components, think about 5 classifications. Now, no, you don't need to know all 5 just yet, but I want you to look at each one of these letters or these fonts. They're all the letter A. Think about that, and each one is different based on what I just told you. The cap height is different. The serifs are different. They're thick or they're thin. They're curved or they're straight. Think about the bowl and the counter. The negative space is different. The thickness of strokes are different. But if you look at the first 4, they are actually different than the last 1. And you've heard of the term serif or sans serif. So I just mentioned on the other screen that we have serifs, or those finishing strokes. Well, the one on the right, the very last one, doesn't have any, and it's sans is without, so sans serif. And so if we can categorize it, if we really wanted to, old style, transitional, modern, Egyptian, and sans serif. But if we just look at serif versus sans serif, and you can understand the difference between those at this point, that's pretty sufficient. Okay. So here I was showing you the X height, and a 12-point font is our standard size that we use. All these fonts are 12 points in terms of scale or size, but each one of the height is different. So the X height is different. So the trade-off is that the ascender or descender are shorter, and that makes it easier to read or more difficult to read. So if you think about that, the X height is really important, even though this point size, which is the unit that we use for measuring, is the same. The height of the letters, the X height, is different. Another way to think about type is to think about a family. And if you think about just your physical family or your family at home, or who you live with, for example, you all have something that relates you to them. But what you have are the things that make you a little bit different. It might be that you all have curly hair, you all have red hair, you all have blue eyes or brown eyes or something like that. You all be left-handed, who knows? But you all have something in common, and then you're all a little bit unique. And so what we do in terms of type is talk about a family. It's a related collection of typefaces that have, in this case, they have the standard, the Roman, but then they also have an italic version, a bold version, and a bold italic, and that's just examples here. But we have the design, and then we have the typefaces, and then we have the family that connects them all. So what you will use for this project is actually one family. You'll use a family, and then you can choose typefaces related to that. Okay. Another way that we think about type is hierarchy, and we have display type, which is large. It could be all caps, it could be biggest, it could be bold, and everything else is regular or Roman. But we think about display type, something that we notice more quickly versus something that is text or body type that we just read and read more comfortably. Reading something in all caps is not going to be comfortable, but reading something in lowercase is going to be more comfortable to read depending on the type that you choose. Okay. Another way to consider type is to think about how many or how long each line is. And what we call with that is line length. And we often have, again, it says 35 to 65, 40 to 70 characters. And in this case, character includes space and punctuation and things like that. But we need to make it comfortable to read, right? So if something is too short versus too long, it's going to be different. Here's one that's maybe too long. And the reason that I say it's too long is, one, if you counted the number of characters, it's way too many characters per line. And what happens is our eye can't figure out where a line ends and the next line begins. So it just makes it uncomfortable to read. And I do that when I read a book anytime. Often as I'm sure you've done it as well. You just reread the same line over and over again because you don't make that connection. On the flip side of it, we have lines that are too short. And we get these words breaking too often for hyphenation. Makes it hard to read, but our eye just moves back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and we just get tired as well. So thinking about how long a line is of text at a time and is how comfortable that it is. And a lot of that is more in sentence format. Okay. Another way to consider type is spacing on a vertical sense. We'll look at it in a moment in the horizontal sense, but the vertical sense is what we call leading. Space between two lines of type vertically measured from baseline to baseline. So we already looked at what that is. Baseline is where the letters sit. But when measuring from baseline to baseline, if it's too close, we might have ascenders and descenders crashing into one another. If it's too wide or too high, we might have too much and it just slows the reader down and we pay more attention to the negative space. So how we use leading can help us slow a reader down, maybe speed them up too much, but it can help us as a design element as well. Horizontally, we have tracking and kerning, and those are gaps between spaces, right? So if you look at takes two, the tracking or the kerning between the T and the A is too much, right? So we want to bring those closer together. We don't have a T all by itself, or in the nearly touch bottom left corner, we don't have the letter Y all by itself. Even with all caps, we run into that same issue. So thinking about kerning and tracking can help us make the text that we use a little more readable, a little more comfortable, right? Because you see the word rub here, and the U and the B are too far apart, or maybe the R and the U are too close. So how can we adjust that spacing to make it more comfortable to read? Okay. Another thing to think about with typography is its alignment. And often, I've said this before, but centered is safe. But the challenge of what something centered is we don't know where a line ends or it begins. And so we have to pay more attention as we're reading. If something is left justified or left aligned, we have a consistent starting point, but the end point is a little bit inconsistent and not necessarily in a negative, uneven way, but it gives us some variety. On the flip side, we slow down a little bit with it if it's right justified because it ends in the same spot, but it doesn't begin in the same spot. Justified can be a thing to create a nice, wonderful shape. However, if you look at the bottom of this justified one, the spacing between words kind of changes because we have fewer words per line, and what that does is in order to make the shape, we have to increase that space between each word, and that can kind of, again, give us a nice shape, but it can provide some awkward spacing that we don't necessarily want. So knowing your alignment and where elements share edges with something else, that's where it can be useful. We want to avoid something called a widow, where we have one line of text or one word of text that is all by itself. And in this sample, have any ideas of how we could fix it? I'll give you a moment to think about that. And maybe you said, well, we could make the text bigger or smaller. I could make the line or the column wider or narrower. I could change the font completely. I could change the wording completely. Or I could adjust the spacing, the kerning, and the tracking so that they are farther apart or closer together. So there's a lot of different options to think about, but what we want to avoid with a widow is one word on a line all by itself. We want it to come about halfway into a column, not just one on the very left edge of that column. On the flip side, we have an orphan. I don't know where these names come from specifically, but we want everything to be grouped that's related, right? So the word faster in this example is actually part of the paragraph to the first column, so we need to adjust some things that way too. We want to avoid letters being set on top of one another, and partly because of how they are designed. They're designed to sit next to one another. So we use or avoid stacking type. There's restaurants or theaters, especially up in Chicago, that do this, and that's I'm not saying what they've done is wrong, but I want you to think about that as a designer, as you can guide the viewer a little bit easier if we rotate the text and think about it that way, because we read left to right, not top to bottom. So think about how the letters are designed and how that can work and how you can guide the viewer on that way. How we can interpret something, its legibility, is important to think about. So in the top example here, can you tell what the word is? Maybe if you stand up and look at it for a little bit, not literally stand, but if you stay and look at it for a little bit, you can tell what it is, but there's all this extra noise. Compare that to the version below it where we can tell what the letter P is, the letter H, the letter I. You can tell what that is. It's more legible, right? And if you think about legibility, being able to interpret letters into words, well, then readability is related to how comfortable all those words are in that particular typeface or font. In this one, it's all caps, but two, there's not consistency in terms of a baseline. There's not, or cap line, there's not consistency there, but it's just all this noise, so it's not very comfortable to read. Same text, much easier to read as you just look at it, so it's more readable, thinking about your typeface that you've chosen. Okay, so how could we use this if we're designing with type? Some basic things that you can consider as you add text. You're going to be creating a hierarchy in your project. For the very last part, we're going to have 4 levels of hierarchy, and how can we use type to create this hierarchy? And in one of the samples that you create, type will be the most prominent or text will be the most prominent, and in the second example you'll be doing something where illustration or the image is the most prominent element. So if you're thinking about it, how can you create and use type? Well, an easy way of creating and using contrast and creating hierarchy is just changing the size of the type. Another way is to change the weight. So I might use something that's bold, I might use something that is italic, I might use a different form in that regard. I might use something that is bold italic, use something that's small caps, but changing the form and the weight of the letters can work to your advantage as well. They're different, they're clearly different. We're not going to be worried about changing the typeface. We're going to stick with one family, but you could change the structure of it so that it actually looks like a different font. We use serif, one serif and one sans serif. Those two are different. Another easy way of thinking about it is using the idea of color. It can help draw hierarchy, can help create contrast and differences. Changing the direction. Everything is horizontally, reads left to right, but then all of a sudden we rotate it and it reads top to bottom. Kind of create some attention to that. And you can even do texture and use that as a background as well, just using text to create an image or component of your design. What we want to do though as we work is to think about not overdoing it with everything. We want to emphasize certain things. We want to create a strong hierarchy, but how do we do that in a way that does not hurt the eyes of the person reading it? So in general, we'll probably just stick with one family of type, we'll think, oh, maybe we'll use minimum styles. We'll use maybe one bold and that's it. And we don't want to just use everything. So keep it simple and keep it calm as you're working with type for your own benefit, for the viewer's benefit. In terms of scale, I'll link to this short video, but we choose type that is different enough in this, and we're not going to show hierarchy by using 12-point type and 14-point type and 16-point type as it. We're going to make it look different. So changing the size, the type size of it, is where we're going to go for this next for this use of text, this use of type, as we come across two different layouts, where we have one where text is a prominent element and one where illustration is a prominent element, and we create hierarchy there. So I'll walk you through that a little bit, but what you're going to get into is the call to action and what do you want people to do if they get your type-based or your image-based solution for this project. So that kind of wraps up type as we look about it, or think about it in this ending point, or not the ending point, the next point of our project.